Fast food gets the blame for America's obesity problem. But the same McDonald's that exists today was serving burgers and fries across America in the 1970s, and barely anyone got fat. In 1971, roughly 14.5% of American adults were obese. Today that number sits at 42%. The fast food was already there. So why didn't it matter? Because the fast food wasn't the variable. Americans in the 1970s weren't leaner because they had more willpower or better discipline. They were leaner because the structural conditions of daily life formed a buffer strong enough to absorb it. This is the story of how that buffer worked and what finally broke it. The first reason is the most obvious one and the most overlooked. In the 1970s, fast food was a treat, not a habit, not a fallback, not a Tuesday night dinner because nobody felt like cooking. It was an event. Americans in the late 1970s got roughly 6% of their daily calories from fast food. By the 2010s, that number had nearly tripled to 16%. But more telling than the calorie percentage is the cultural attitude. Eating at a restaurant in the 1970s was an anomaly, something you did for a birthday, a family outing, a teenage date. The rest of the week, you ate at home. Home cooking, by its nature, is a metabolic protector. You use whole ingredients. You control portions. There is no food science team engineering your dinner to overwrite your satiety signal. In 1970, food consumed outside the home accounted for 34% of the average food budget. By the late 1990s, that had climbed to 47%. The shift away from the family dinner table did not just change where Americans ate, it changed what their bodies were exposed to meal after meal, year after year. Even the fast food restaurants themselves felt different. Pizza Hut in the 1970s was a sit-down experience with a rustic interior, a salad bar, and cloth napkins on some tables. The social ritual of the meal was still intact. You sat down, you ate together, you stopped when the food was gone. The drive-through model, which decouples eating from any social context and turns it into a mobile, mindless activity, did not dominate the industry until the 1980s. Eating on the go, one of the most reliable predictors of overeating, was not yet the default. If you are the person who finds it fascinating how invisible systems shape the world around us, you will want to subscribe and stick around so you do not miss the next one. Now here is where it gets interesting, because even when Americans did eat fast food in the 1970s, they were eating something that barely resembles what is served today. Start with the portions. A standard soda in the early fast food era was 6.5 ounces. Let that land for a second. The small size at most chains today is 16 ounces. The large at many convenience stores hits 32, 44, even 64 ounces. The famous 7-Eleven double gulp, 64 fluid ounces of soda, is essentially a small bucket. That product did not exist in the 1970s. Neither did the psychology behind it. The economics of supersizing were pioneered by a man named David Wallerstein, who discovered while managing movie theaters in the 1960s that customers would not buy 2 small bags of popcorn, but they would buy one enormous one. He brought that insight to the McDonald's board in 1971, but the industry-wide rollout of true value supersizing did not hit until 1987 for McDonald's and accelerated through the early 1990s. In the 1970s, you bought what you intended to eat because the infrastructure for buying more did not really exist yet. A typical cheeseburger in the early 1970s ran about 330 calories. Today, fast food burgers routinely top 600 calories, with premium options breaching 1,000. French fries went from roughly 200 calories per serving to 610. The physical containers for overeating simply had not been built yet. The average daily caloric intake in 1970 was around 2,160 calories. By the 21st century, that had risen to 2,673, a 20% increase driven almost entirely by portion inflation and snacking. Speaking of snacking, the 1970s barely had one. This is one of the most underappreciated differences between then and now. In 1977, the average American adolescent consumed about one snack per day, which contributed roughly 14% of their total caloric intake. By the mid-2000s, that had climbed to 1.7 snacks a day, accounting for nearly 25% of daily calories. And for adults, snacking prevalence went from 71% of the population to 97%. Nearly total adoption. Snacking went from a minor habit to a near universal behavior, adding an estimated 570 extra calories per day on average. But it wasn't just frequency, it was structure. The 3-meal schedule of the 1970s created long windows, 4 to 6 hours at a stretch, where insulin levels dropped and the body could tap into stored fat for energy. The metabolism got to rest. Today, constant grazing keeps insulin chronically elevated, blocking that fat-burning window entirely. The 3-meal structure wasn't discipline. It was just how days were organized. And it quietly served as a metabolic reset that most people didn't know they were benefiting from. Here is something almost nobody talks about when they discuss the 1970s and health: what was actually in the fryer. For most of its early history, McDonald's cooked its fries in beef tallow, a blend that was, by accident rather than design, about 93% beef tallow and 7% vegetable oil. The reason was simple. The supplier, a small operation called Interstate Foods, could not afford the equipment needed to hydrogenate vegetable oil, so they used tallow instead. The result was a fry with a distinct, savory flavor that became iconic. In 1990, after a relentless campaign by health advocates concerned about saturated fat and cholesterol, McDonald's switched to 100% vegetable oil. The problem was this: to keep vegetable oil shelf-stable and semi-solid, you have to hydrogenate it. And hydrogenation produces trans fats. Trans fats, it turned out, are significantly more damaging to metabolic and cardiovascular health than the saturated fat they replaced. A consumer in the 1970s eating those tallow-fried fries consumed a product with no industrially produced trans fats. The healthier version that replaced it was, metabolically, far worse. There is another layer to this. Beef tallow is satiating. The rich, meaty flavor signals fullness in a way that vegetable oil does not replicate. When chains switched oils, they started adding natural beef flavorings, often derived from milk and wheat, to approximate the original taste. They never really got there. Without that satiety signal, the newer, theoretically healthier fries may have actually encouraged people to eat more. It also wasn't just what Americans ate, it was how much they moved without ever thinking about it. In the early 1960s, nearly half of all private sector jobs in the United States required at least moderate intensity physical activity in construction, agriculture, manufacturing, and mining. These were jobs that demanded your body for 8 hours a day. By 2008, that number had dropped below 20%. Researchers estimate that the decline in occupational physical activity alone accounts for a drop of roughly 140 calories per day for men and 124 for women. Run the math on that across decades, and it maps almost precisely onto the rise in mean body weight tracked by NHANES survey data. Children were moving too, not because anyone told them to, but because that is how things worked. In 1969, roughly 48% of K through 8 students walked or biked to school. Among kids who lived within a mile of their school, an extraordinary 89% got there on foot or by bicycle. By 2009, total active commuting had collapsed to 13%, and even among kids living within a mile of school, only 35% still walked. That daily mileage, several miles a week, 5 days a week, wasn't exercise. It was just life. And it built a caloric baseline that absorbed the occasional burger and fries without registering on a scale. At home, movement was also unavoidable in a way it simply is not today. Many households did not have TV remotes. You had to get up to change the channel. Household labor was more physical, scrubbing, hauling, lifting. Life had friction built into it, and that friction burned calories passively. Alongside all of this, the ingredient landscape of the 1970s had not yet been fully transformed by the technologies that would rewrite American metabolism in the decades to come. High fructose corn syrup was developed in Japan in the 1960s and began entering the American food supply in the early 1970s. But it did not dominate until later. Coca-Cola did not fully switch its flagship product from sucrose to HFCS 55 until 1980, partly driven by the cost pressures of the cola wars. Between 1970 and 1997, fructose consumption from HFCS increased more than 100-fold, while sucrose consumption fell by a third. In the 1970s, the American consumer was getting a far lower dose of fructose, and that matters because, unlike sucrose, HFCS is processed primarily in the liver and does not trigger the same satiety signals in the brain. The I'm full switch does not click the same way. At the same time, the science of hyper-palatable food engineering was only just beginning. In 1971, a psychophysicist named Howard Moskowitz coined the term bliss point, the precise ratio of salt, sugar, and fat that maximizes a food's appeal and triggers a dopamine response similar to addictive substances. He would go on to help companies like Pepsi, Prego, and Campbell's optimize their recipes around this principle. But in the 1970s, the fast food menu was still largely composed of straightforward items: burgers, fries, shakes, rather than the multi-layered lab-engineered products designed to override satiety entirely. The food was tasty, it was not yet pharmacological. So what broke the buffer? It did not break all at once. It broke in stages across roughly 15 years as several trends converged simultaneously. The shift from the all-American meal with small portions, simple ingredients, and purchased as a treat, to the value pack and supersize model happened in the mid to late 1980s. Wendy's launched its 99-cent value menu in 1989. McDonald's rolled out true supersize options in 1987. The economic logic of selling more calories per dollar replaced the earlier logic of selling speed and consistency. At the same time, sucrose gave way to high fructose corn syrup across the processed food supply, removing the body's natural off switch from hundreds of products. Beef tallow gave way to hydrogenated vegetable oil, introducing trans fats into the daily diet. The goods-producing labor sector contracted as the service economy expanded, and the average worker went from a job that demanded physical effort to one performed in a chair. Children stopped walking to school as suburban sprawl pushed schools further from neighborhoods, and the three-meal structure collapsed under the weight of a snacking industry that had learned, through food science, how to make eating between meals feel not just acceptable but necessary. None of it was a conspiracy. It was an optimization of profit, of convenience, of efficiency that happened to systematically dismantle every environmental factor that had once made healthy weight automatic. The lesson of the 1970s is not that fast food is harmless. It is that fast food's impact is governed entirely by the environment surrounding it. When that environment included physical labor, home cooking, active commutes, modest portions, and a food supply that had not yet been engineered to override your biology, a burger and fries a few times a month was a footnote. When every one of those buffers was removed, the same burger became part of a system designed, layer by layer, to make weight gain the path of least resistance. The food did not change America's body. The architecture did, and we built that architecture ourselves, one convenience at a time, so gradually that nobody noticed until the photos from the 1970s started looking like a different country.